Chapter 156 Aftermath of Playing Outside. Good girl, now close your eyes and give me a kiss. Mia's shoulders were shaking with laughter as she obediently closed her eyes and childishly puckered out her lips for a kiss. But instead of Neil's lips, a cold, wet snow kissed her back, a face full of it. He deliberately smashed it all over her cheeks while she sputtered and laughed harder. Then he got up. Now, he said, grinning like a satisfied sultan as he held a hand out to help her up, you're sure you've had enough of the play? I've had more than enough, Mia laughed, finally noticing how boyishly happy and relaxed he looked after what had been nothing more meaningful than frolicking in the snow. The last traces of tension were gone from his handsome face, and she felt a mixture of tenderness and happiness that something as ordinary as a snow fight evidently gave him so much pleasure. She'd never seen him laugh nor smile this hard, to the extent he was wiping off tears of laughter from the corner of his eyes. His happiness, for some reason, made her even happier than she'd ever been for the past 5 years. She'd also never laughed this much after her mother's passing, nor had she played in the snow like this as an adult. Either way, she realized one thing. Neil had been exactly right when he said to concentrate only on enjoying the present and creating memories for the future. It was clearly what he needed at this point in his life, and she vowed to give him just that until he would be unable to take all the happiness. Neil stepped through the deep snow, holding her arm for support, his mind completely on the project of building the snowman ahead of him, that he didn't notice Mia's mischievous grinning face. I assume we can now get down to serious snowman business, he announced, standing in front of the formless lump of snow that had been her original snowman and studying it with his hands on his waist and his back to her. Now that you understand the supreme consequences of provoking someone so much larger, stronger, and wiser than your little self. And since I've finally gotten your proper respect, I have some very specific ideas about this deformed snow. Before he could complete his words, a huge snowball hit him disrespectfully on the back of his head. I see you haven't learned to respect me yet, he laughed as he swirled around and saw that she was about to hit him with another snowball. He didn't let her throw the snowball before he ran after her. I've learned my lesson, I won't do it again, Neil. She giggled as he chased after her. Oh, let me be the one to decide. Stop right there. Their laughter rang out in the winter afternoon, startling the squirrels who watched from the trees while the two humans shattered the peace of the atmosphere, playing like children in the snow, chasing each other around trees, flinging snowballs, and then got down to the business of completing a snowman that, when finished, resembled no other snowman in recorded history. After playing in the snow for hours, Mia and Neil sat together on the sofa beside the fireplace, with their legs stretched out, their feet propped side by side on the coffee table with a blanket stretched over them. Mia gazed out the glass walls of the living room with a faint smile. She was deliciously exhausted from their day outside, a hearty meal, and Neil's intense lovemaking on the sofa the moment they'd returned. He hadn't even given her a moment of rest. He'd just locked eyes with her, then everything was a blur when their lips locked together. He'd kissed her like it was their first time, like he was a starving man and she was his water. Before she'd known anything, they were both naked and he was inside her within seconds, thrusting hard and fast like he wanted to be one with her. She'd shamelessly moaned for him to go faster when he'd slowed down to make sure she was fine. She'd been too driven by her desires to feel embarrassed at that moment when she was on the verge of an orgasm. She'd moaned and cried his name so hard her voice had turned hoarse when he'd collapsed onto her after they'd both exhausted their strength. Even now, when the intense lovemaking was long over and he was lost in thought, gazing into the fireplace, she noticed he kept his arm around her, holding her close to his side, her head on his shoulder, as if he very much enjoyed having her close and touching her. Occasionally his fingers played with her disheveled hair and she liked that, but at the moment her mind was on the so-called snowman he'd built just beyond the glass wall. With the living room lights dimmed to a mellow glow and the fire in the fireplace reduced to orange cinders, she could just make out the looming, shadowy form of the snowman outside the glass wall. Neil was incredibly creative and imaginative, she thought with a smile, which shouldn't have been surprising, given his career as a man who'd lived his entire life taking different identities, not to mention the fact that he taught himself how to make weapons at a very young age. But even so, a snowman ought to look like a snowman, not a huge, abnormal dinosaur. What are you thinking about? Neil asked, his lips brushing a soft kiss on the top of her hair. Mia tipped her chin up to see his face and grinned. Your snowman. Didn't anyone ever tell you that a snowman is supposed to be merry? That, he corrected, looking proud and boyish as he studied the snowman through the glass, is not a snowman but a snow monster. If Olaf were to ever set eyes on that snow monster, he'd run until he lost his stubby legs. She laughed, imagining her favorite cartoon character seeing Neil's snowman. Olaf? He asked, curious. Who is that? She smiled. Olaf, in Frozen, the movie I told you about yesterday. Seeing his expression, she guessed he had no idea what movie she was talking about, and that realization made her curious about something she'd been dying to know. What kind of depraved childhood did you have not to know of Frozen? She teased. Tell me about it. Depraved, Neil muttered, smiling faintly and tightening his arm around her. He could not seem to get enough of her, in bed or out of it, and that was an unprecedented experience for him. She fit the curve of his arm as if she were made for him. In bed, she was a temptress, an angel, and a courtesan. She could drive him to incomparable heights of passion with just a sound, a look, or a touch. Out of bed, she was funny, fascinating, stubborn, witty, and intelligent. She could anger him with a word and then melt away his anger with a smile. She was naturally sophisticated, devoid of pretension, and filled with so much life and love that she mesmerized him at times, like when she talked about children and all her experience in the entertainment industry. He had kidnapped her, and in return, she had saved his life. He was supposed to be the cunning, hardened convict, and yet she had been clever enough and brave enough to escape right out from under his nose. Then she had turned around and willingly surrendered her virginity to him with a pure sweetness that made him ache whenever he thought about it. Apart from the fact that he'd known her as a boy, he could melt in the face of her courage, gentleness, and generosity. He was 6 years older and 1,000 times harder than she, and yet something about her softened him and made him like being soft, both of which were new experiences for him. Before he went to prison, he'd been accused by women, most especially Davina, of being everything from distant and unapproachable to cold and ruthless. Several unnameable women in his past had told him he was like a machine, and one of them had dared to say he turned on for sex and then turned off for everything else except his work. During one of his frequent arguments with Davina, she had told him he could charm a snake and he was just as cold as one. On the other hand, he had never known a woman in his adult life, including Davina, whose primary interest wasn't in forcing him to do things he didn't like, and making his uncle get him to do it when he'd refuse her. Not to mention all the other phonies he'd had to endure in the military and in the hands of David Wayner. It wasn't particularly surprising that he'd become distrustful, disheartened, and callous. No, Neil thought, that wasn't true. The truth was he had already been that way before he joined the military. Callous and cold enough to be able to turn his back on a normal life of carrying on his father's name, and even his own real name when he was only 12. Enough to banish it all from his mind and never, ever look back or discuss it with anyone, not even Davina or Liam, nor the media who would do anything to know his background when he'd first made his name known to the country as Neil Wayner. His former name, the Galvera relatives, who'd do anything to have him back into the family, and his past were dead facts that he tried to bury after his parents' death, and he'd managed to do that permanently and irrevocably after he was sent to prison. And nothing on this earth would ever make him speak about his childhood and his past ever again. Nothing. Neil? She called, and the simple sound of her voice saying his name had a magical effect on him. His name sounded special, different in her mouth. Do you realize I don't know very much about you, even though we've been. Mia stopped, not certain if it was assuming too much to use the word lovers now that they'd been intimate with each other. In the past, she had no name for their short-time relationship, and now 5 years later, she still had no name for it even though they'd had sex more than once and they'd both enjoyed it. Neil heard the embarrassed uncertainty in her voice and smiled because he assumed she was probably searching for some prim and proper word to use to describe the unbridled passion they'd shared, or else a word to use for what they were to each other, now that they'd shared it. He smiled into her hair and whispered softly, "Which would you prefer, one word or a phrase?" Chapter 157 His Past, Part 1. He smiled into her hair and whispered softly, "Which would you prefer, one word or a phrase?" Don't be so smug. I happen to know more about sex and relationships than you'd think. I've read a lot about it. Then what's the problem? Neil chuckled, but her answer banished his laughter, stopped his breath, and melted his heart completely. Somehow, she said, thoughtfully studying her hand that was resting on his lap, The term sexual intercourse seems all wrong to describe our relationship, and it feels wrong to describe something that is so sweet when we do it. And so deep, and so profound. Neil leaned his head against the back of the sofa and closed his eyes, steadying himself, wondering why she had this insane effect on him. Never in all of his adult life had he felt this way towards any woman but her, and never would he have thought a day would come when he'd give a name to a relationship with a woman. In the past, he tried his best to avoid having any relationship that had any name other than a casual fling. But today, he was going against another one of his principles by thinking of a name for their relationship, a name that would sit well with Mia and make her happy. A moment later, he managed to say in a semi-formal voice, "How does the term lovers sound to you?" "Lovers," she agreed, nodding her head several times. "I like that," she smiled, suppressing the happiness that surged through her blood at that name. Then she continued to say, "What I was trying to explain earlier is that even though we've been lovers, I don't really know anything about you." "You know everything about me," he said, subconsciously playing with her hair. "Everyone in the country does. There's nothing more to know." Mia frowned her brows. "I don't. Other than the fact that you are Neil Wayner, I know nothing about your real life," she argued. "What would you like to know then?" "Well, for a start, is Neil Wayner your real name, or did you change it when you joined the military?" "I legally changed my name when I joined the military. Neil Wayner was given to me by my uncle," he informed, despite the fact that he didn't want to speak to her about his past nor anything about his life then. "Really?" She turned her head, her soft cheek rubbing against his arm as she looked up at him. Even with his eyes closed, he could feel her watching him, see her curious smile, and while he waited for the inevitable question he knew was coming next, he remembered other things about her. "How dare you ever suggest I would even consider telling anyone you raped me?" she'd said to him outside. And he'd felt like he'd won a jackpot when she'd said those words to him. Did she even have any idea how much she'd been turning him crazy for the past few days? He thought, but her soft voice intruded his thoughts. "What was your real name before you changed it to Neil?" she asked. It was exactly the question Neil had expected, the one he'd never answered for anyone, but before he could stop himself, he told her. "Xavier Galvera." Mia heard the name but she didn't register it at first until she'd almost asked him another question before she realized the familiar name he'd mentioned. Slowly but gradually, realization dawned on her. "Xavier Galvera," she muttered softly, looking up onto his face. "It was you all along. You are Mr. Galvera, the mysterious CEO, and the same person who'd sponsored my education in Ivy Grove. Why did you hide your identity as Xavier?" Mia saw the tension in his jaw at her question, and when he opened his eyes, she was stunned by the harsh expression in them. "It's a long story," he said shortly. "Oh," she said, and knew immediately that it was an unpleasant enough story to him that it was best left completely alone for the time being. The last thing she wanted was to ruin his mood. He'd hidden his identity as Mr. Galvera for a reason, and since he wasn't in the mood to discuss that, she decided not to push the topic despite the curiosity eating at her soul. Instead, she said the first thing that came to mind to distract him and lighten his mood. "I already know a lot of things about both your identities. I know that you joined the military at a young age, and I know that the Galvera Enterprises did well even when you didn't personally run the company on a full-time basis. So, it's enough for me to know that you are a hard-working man." Neil looked down at her. He was well aware that she had set aside her natural curiosity about his long story, and it warmed the chill that had come over him when he'd had to think of his past. "You must be one of those nosy journalists who dug into my personal life as Neil and Xavier, aren't you?" he teased. Mia nodded guiltily, pleased and relieved that her change of topic had worked so quickly. "Because of my research, I already know you grew up on your own in the camp as Neil, and I know that you are portrayed as a hideous man as Xavier Galvera, the man with a Spanish accent. Did I just say something funny?" she asked when she noticed the amusement in his gray eyes. "At the risk of ruining all your illusions, Princess," Neil said, chuckling, "those things were all products of your people's, the journalists', overactive imagination. And you heard for yourself, I have no accent, nor do I look hideous." Mia laughed, amused by his confidence, and her infectious laughter rang out like music in Neil's head, lightening his heart as she shifted on the sofa to face him, pulling her knees up against her chest. Wrapping her arms around them, she studied him in fascinated absorption. "Once upon a time, I used to know a girl like you in the past," he teased, reaching for his wine glass on the table, trying to distract her from asking the next inevitable question about himself by changing the subject. And you remind me so much of her, your laughter, smile, and dimples. I could have sworn you were her until you told me you didn't grow up in Mirage Mesa. He said, sipping his wine and studying her expression through the glass. I also know a boy like you, she muttered softly, looking lost for a moment. Neil stopped in the act of swallowing his drink. What? She looked up at him, startled at the fact that she'd said those words out, but seeing his confused frown, she felt the need to explain what she meant to him. I mean, I also know a boy like you in my dreams. Not actually like you, but your eyes are the same. You might think me weird, but sometimes I feel like I've lived another life before, and I had a crush on a boy with gray eyes, which made sense on the fact that I'm obsessed with gray eyes now. Neil felt it happening again, that peculiar sharp tug on his heart, the funny ache in his chest whenever she smiled like that. So do you believe that your mind is making up stuff? He asked, trying his best not to tell her that everything she spoke of had happened in this lifetime and that she'd somehow lost those memories due to something unknown to both of them. He wanted to tell her that they'd indeed sat on a white swing where he taught her how to play the guitar and sing a song, but then he held back, not knowing what that would cause to her mental health when she didn't remember it as something she'd lived and experienced. I'm not sure. My therapist mentioned schizophrenia, she chuckled bitterly, her gaze shifting to her bent knees. To steer the conversation in a different direction, she asked, what about you? What happened to the girl you mentioned I reminded you of? My younger self made a silly vow to marry her when he's older, he said softly, but she vanished from his life before he'd grown into a man and made her his. You mean she was your childhood sweetheart? She asked with widened eyes, and when he nodded his head and said, something like that, her fist clenched on the blanket around her knees. Though it was something his younger self had said, Mia couldn't help the little jealousy that rose up to her heart at the realization that he had a childhood sweetheart who he'd vowed to marry when he grew older. Could that be the reason he wasn't willing to open up to the thought of loving another woman? She wondered silently, because she'd heard and read in novels where some men were never able to move on from their childhood sweetheart regardless of the time that passed. So I remind you of her? She asked, and when he nodded his head again, she hid her hurt behind a laughter that didn't reach her eyes. Chapter 158 His Past, Part 2. She must have grown into a beautiful woman by now, Mia muttered. Tell me more about her. Neil's reply was a shout of laughter that rebounded off the ceiling, and before Mia could react, he wrapped his arms around her, hauled her next to him, and buried his laughing face in her hair. Heavens help me, he whispered. She'd grown into the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Oh, she drawled, and he laughed harder. Good Lord, are you all right? Mia burst out, dumbstruck at his unusual laughter. You must be high on water, Mr. Wayner. His second shout of laughter nearly drowned out her next sentence. Laughing is good. Keep on. Inordinately pleased that she could make him laugh like this, Mia leaned her head against his chest, but as soon as he stopped laughing she said, now it's your turn. What happened to your family? I mean, why did you grow up in the camp? Neil slowly lifted his face from her fragrant hair and tipped her chin up. Because I had nowhere else to go, but the camp where I played with guns instead of toys. And? Mia prompted, confused by her odd impression that he felt a special importance in answering that question without changing the subject. And, he said, looking into her puzzled eyes, I became a soldier instead of taking on the legacy of the Galvera's ancestors. Mia glared at him as she said, Neil Wayner was born in a rich family. But then many articles said you grew up on your own, no family, living on the street, when in truth you are a Galvera. I believed those articles and sympathized with you like I knew you. I apologize for misleading you and the other journalists, he said, chuckling at her indignant look. But the truth is not far apart from what those articles said about me. At any rate, I did grow up without any family and left the Galvera estate before I was an adult, and I was on my own after that. Mia wanted to ask why he'd left home, but then she held back again just so she wouldn't ruin his mood. Instead, she stuck to basics for the moment. Do you have any siblings? I had a little sister at the age of 5, he said. What do you mean, had? She asked, confused. I mean a lot of things, I suppose, he said with a sigh, leaning his head back against the sofa again, feeling her shift her body, and they returned to their former position with their legs stretched out on the table with his arms wrapped around her. If you don't want to talk about that for some reason, she said, sensitive to his changing mood, there's no need to do it. Neil knew he was going to tell her all of it, but he didn't want to examine the strange feelings that were compelling him to do it, to tell her everything about his life which he'd never told anyone. He'd never felt the need or desire to answer these same questions from Davina. But then he'd never trusted her or anyone else with anything that might bring him pain. Perhaps because Mia had already given him so much, he felt he owed her answers. He tightened his arm around her and she moved closer to him, her face resting on his chest. I've never talked about any of this with anyone before. It isn't that long or an interesting story, but if I sound strange, it's because it's very unpleasant for me and because I feel a little odd discussing it for the first time in many years. Mia kept silent, stunned and flattered that he was going to tell her something he'd obviously never told anyone before. When I was 5, my parents had a little girl, he began, and she was the cutest little thing I'd ever seen until. Neil paused, trying to think of the right words and couldn't. She unknowingly killed herself at the age of 2 when she was left unattended for some moments. Mia couldn't stop her horrified intake of breath. My God, how did that happen? Neil's chest lifted beneath her cheek as he drew in his breath and slowly expelled it. It was an accident. She liked to copy everything I did, and when I was a boy, I had a tendency to play with toy guns and knives to battle my imaginary foes. Unfortunately, my little sister got hold of a real knife when no one was around and accidentally stabbed herself in the chest. Neil could still vividly remember the day he'd found his little sister, who he'd started to grow attached to, lying dead on the floor of the kitchen. He'd never told anyone about her, silently blaming himself for her tragic death for an entire year until he met Mimi, who unknowingly and playfully helped him come to terms with his grief and taught him to embrace his playful side once more. With her cute and sweet presence, he was able to let go of the guilt and hold on to the fond memories he shared with his sister during her lifetime. However, he had never spoken of her to anyone until this moment. When Neil fell silent, Mia asked, "What was her name?" "Melissa," he automatically answered. "Such a lovely name," she whispered softly as she gently ran her hands up and down his chest, as if to offer comfort for his loss. "What about your parents? I mean, what happened to them?" Neil's expression darkened. "They passed away too." "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed in shock, attempting to pull away from his chest to meet his gaze, but he held her in place with his arm, preventing her from doing so. Sensing that he did not want her sympathy, or perhaps did not want her to see his expression, Mia settled back against his chest and inquired, "How did they die?" "They were murdered," he ground out through clenched teeth, his voice taking on a menacing tone that slightly unnerved Mia. However, she silently continued her soothing strokes on his chest, while trying to fathom the tragedy he must have endured throughout his life with his entire family gone. "By whom?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "I don't know. I was only 12 when that happened and I wasn't at home. I went to get ice cream for the little girl I told you about. But when I returned," he paused for a moment, "everything was gone. My parents, my little friend, my life. It was all ruined. All I remember was seeing my parents' dead bodies being burned in our backyard." I'm sorry you had to witness that," she murmured, unsure of what to say. She could only imagine the pain he must have endured as a young boy witnessing such a tragedy. The image of a young Neil experiencing such horror and enduring grief alone filled her with tenderness and sympathy, causing her heart to ache with love for him. He'd been through a hellish ordeal far worse than what she'd experienced when she lost her mother. "How did you manage to cope after that?" she inquired, holding back her tears and embracing him tightly around the waist. "I coped just fine," he said. "I hunted down the source of their death and vowed to kill it when I grew older, but too bad it was never there by the time I was ready to kill it," he said, referring to Ella. But because he didn't want to talk about the woman, he continued to speak to distract Mia from asking questions about the source he'd mentioned. "When I saw my parents get burned, I was lost and panicked. Not knowing where to go, I left the Galvera estate and the entire city and began to walk around in torn clothes, barefoot on the street begging for food, until I came across a man who said he was my mother's brother. He took me away and took me in. However, if I'd known he was a heartless freak, I'd have never gone with him." Mia noticed the change in his tone and knew immediately that his uncle was bad news in his life. "What did he do to you?" she asked gently. He let out a humorless laughter as he said, "He treated me worse than an animal should be treated." His arms tightened around her as if the memories were unpleasant to him. And she tipped her chin up and said, "Tell me about him and what he did to you." His gray eyes turned distant as if looking back to the memories. The first day he took me to his house, I thought he was going to give me food and a place to sleep after I'd suffered on the streets of Mirage Mesa for many days and nights, but David Wayner did no such thing. Instead, he locked me up in a damned cage meant for dogs. Chapter 159, telling her about his family's death. His gray eyes turned distant as if looking back to the memories. The first day he took me to his house, I thought he was going to give me food and a place to sleep after I'd suffered on the streets of Mirage Mesa for many days and nights. But David Wayner did no such thing. Instead, he locked me up in a damned cage meant for dogs. Why would he do such a thing to you? She asked, puzzled at the fact that his uncle would be heartless enough to treat his sister's son like that. He was trying to discipline me because I was a Galvera, and he believed that the entire Galvera bloodline consisted of arrogant, ruthless, prideful men. He also told me that he hated my father for marrying my mother and turning her against him and her family. My mother was a Wayner and came from a long line of rigidly upright people with impossibly high standards for themselves and everyone else. They were against her marriage to a Galvera because they believed the Galveras to be reckless, irresponsible, charming, and heartless, which was a complete opposite to the Wayners. The most prominent trait of the Galveras, consistently evident in the male lineage, was their reputation for being womanizers. This reputation for lechery was well known in their community in Puerto Rico, and it was a trait that they took great pride in, except for my late father. However, the others all went through the same path. Including, and especially, my grandfather. I'm not sure a Casanova had anything on the Galvera men when it came to wanting women. To give you a non-offensive example, when my father and his brothers each turned 14, my grandfather gave them a hooker for a birthday present. He had a little private birthday party at the main Galvera estate, and the hooker he'd selected was brought there to attend the party and then go upstairs with the birthday boy. What did your grandmother think of that? Mia asked in disgust of such an act. Where was she at the time your grandfather did that to your father and his brothers? I don't know, I only knew of this when I dug into my family's history after my uncle wouldn't forget to remind me of how the Galvera's disgusting blood runs in my veins, how heartless and ruthless I'd become just like my late grandfather. Neil grew quiet, and Mia thought he wasn't going to say anything else, and then he added, my grandfather died a year after my father married my mother, and my father was finally able to move out of the main Galvera estate in Puerto Rico to Mirage Mesa where he'd studied and met my mom. He took over the company there and started his family. However, anyone who knew the history of the Galveras felt pity for my mom for marrying my father who was already madly and blindly in love with another woman. What? How? Mia asked. It's a long story I wouldn't want to dive into because it will divert the topic away from my uncle, he said. My uncle hated my father to the extent he made the Wayners disown his own blood sister. But then when he heard of their death, he immediately came in search of me to discipline me into a submissive, obedient Galvera. He reached for his wine and tossed down the rest of it as if he were trying to wash away the taste of his words. Then he stared absently into the empty glass. What else did he do to you apart from locking you in a cage? She asked finally. He glanced at her as if he'd almost forgotten she was there. He beat me up for the slightest mistake with a barbed wire. He never allowed me for once to lay on any of the beds in his house but in the servants' room. For months, I went through hell in his hands before he finally decided to take me to the camp. I was taken to the camp with a torn body. I had several injuries from his beating, my entire torso was unsightly, and I was so skinny for my age. He stopped again and his fingers tightened around the glass he was holding. Despite the years that had passed, the pain was still fresh in his memories. The hate he'd received from his own uncle was still carved inside his heart. For years he'd feared the man and did everything that was asked of him. He had no fun memories of all his teenage years because he'd spent it going through intense training to get revenge from the Doc Roll. David Wayner had made sure he had nothing whatsoever to distract him from his path for revenge, and when he'd started to grow attached to Mia Harrison 5 years ago, he'd betrayed Neil and gave away the investigation of the mall incident. When Neil didn't continue to speak, Mia spoke in disgust and anger. If he dislikes your father, what crime did a 12-year-old boy do to receive such treatment? She said, hating his uncle for what he'd made Neil go through as a boy. No wonder he had several injuries on his chest where he'd tattooed to hide them. A sardonic smile tugged at his lips as he replied, because I happened to have been a dead ringer for my father. We had the same face, the same eyes, and height, which, as you can imagine, did not endear me to my uncle in the least. He hated me as much as he did my father. Mia thought that was the most ridiculously biased thing she'd ever heard, but she kept her feelings to herself and asked, "What was it like in the camp for you?" "It was hard, but not as hard as my life in the Wainers' estate," he said, keeping away the part where his uncle would always remind him why he'd joined the military, and how he'd gone there to train and get his revenge. "I spent most of my time training and striving to make my uncle see that I can do better than he'd thought, but nothing I did was enough to make him see that I am not Noah Galvera but Xavier Galvera." Mia had absorbed every word he'd said so far. More than that, she'd absorbed every subtle change of his tone and expression. Even though he'd invariably included himself when he discussed the Galvera's behaviors, she'd caught the disdain lacing his voice when he spoke of his late grandfather. She was also drawing some very interesting conclusions from what he had not said. "And what about you?" she asked cautiously. "How did you feel about your uncle?" He quirked a challenging brow at her. "What makes you think I felt any differently about him than he did me?" She didn't hedge. "I sense you did." He nodded silent approval at her acuity. "I admired him before, but not anymore. Now, can we drop the topic of my past?" "It's boring," he said, looking down at her, but she shook her head. "Not yet. You mentioned that your family were murdered. Can you tell me more about that part?" she asked cautiously. "No," he said shortly. Mia had a feeling she was treading into forbidden territory with the tone of his voice, but she took the leap anyway. With quiet tenderness, she said, "Please, I want to know everything about you. So that I could completely melt the ice in your heart with my love, and break the walls in your heart with my care," she added internally. "Please," she added again. When Neil couldn't deny the tenderness he felt in his chest from her pleading eyes, he said dryly, "You're awfully adorable for a woman of 26. "Nice tactic," she replied, looking impressed and matching his tone perfectly. "If you can't fool me, ridicule me." "Well said," he whispered softly, bending his head to kiss her. "And," she continued, turning her head away so that his only available target was her cheek, not her mouth, "if ridiculing me fails, try to distract me from the topic." His chuckle was rich and deep as he took her chin between his thumb and forefinger and firmly tipped her mouth up to his. "You know," he said with a slow smile, "you could become a real pain in the ass sometimes." "Oh, please, no. Don't resort to flattery now," she laughed, swiftly preventing him from kissing her to distract her from the topic. "I know what you're trying to do, and that isn't enough to distract me from my question. Who killed your parents?" He covered her laughing lips with his. "A first-class pain in the ass." Mia went down in defeat as he whispered against her lips and plunged his tongue into her parted lips. Sliding her hands up his shoulders, she yielded to the demanding persuasion of his kiss, putting her heart and soul into it, feeling that no matter how much she gave, he gave back more, and no matter how many times they'd kissed and made love, she'd never have enough of him. When he finally let her go, she expected him to suggest they go to bed and make love again. Instead, he said, "Since I can't outwit you, I suppose I owe you an answer about that. After that, I'd like to drop the subject of my background entirely, assuming your curiosity is satisfied?" Mia didn't think she could ever learn enough about him to be satisfied, but she understood his feelings about this particular subject. When she nodded, he explained, "When I was a boy, I used to think my parents were the best because they loved each other no matter what, but I was proven wrong the day I discovered my father had another woman who he'd loved before marrying my mom. And that their entire happily married life was just a facade to trick their 2 children. Noah Galvera had never loved his wife, not even when they'd had a son and a daughter. However, our lives had been just fine even with that until the day his lover moved to our city. He started to come home late every night, and when he returned, he'd argue with my mom about Ella, his woman. One night I walked into them arguing in the kitchen about her. My poor mom was so disheartened to discover that my father was still in contact with his lover despite being married. However, Noah Galvera denied that fact and said he was only trying to help the woman and nothing else." Neil fell silent for a moment, and Mia looked up at his face with a puzzled expression. "Help her from what?" "Her abusive husband," he replied with a detached voice. "It turned out his past lover ended up marrying the leader of the mafia organization, Doc Kroll, a complete asshole who'd beat her for whatever reason. My dad tried to play a hero in her life, but he ended up risking our own family's life by doing so. The husband somehow found out about my father's plans to get his wife away from him, and he attacked first and killed my parents." "What about his wife? What did he do to her?" she asked, disheartened by his parents' deaths and the cause of it. "Ella disappeared from the face of the earth," he chuckled darkly. "She disappeared before I could get to her. She must have been frightened by my threat to end her life, or she couldn't stand her husband, but I've searched everywhere for her and I couldn't find her." "Were you really going to end her life?" she asked, horrified that he'd even think of doing such a thing to an innocent woman, but then she understood what he must have felt by losing his parents because of her interference in their lives. "Yes," he answered emotionlessly. "I was going to kill her the same way my parents were killed. But years later, when I couldn't find her, I gave up on that decision. However, no matter the time that has passed, I will never forgive her nor forget what she'd done to our lives." "What about her husband?" she asked cautiously. Chapter 160. No other can replace her. "What about her husband?" she asked cautiously. At that question, his face took on that mask-like look, carefully blank, deliberately expressionless, with dangerously darkened eyes, and it made her extremely uneasy whenever he did that. "I don't know." After a prolonged moment of silence, he added, "He killed my parents and got away with the crime. When I was a boy, I'd only seen Ella once in our house when she was talking to my mom about something, but I never knew her family background nor her husband's because the damned man was a shady bastard who made sure to clean up his tracks." Neil fell silent again as he recalled all the years he'd spent trying to look for the bastard. If only he'd been smart enough as a 12-year-old to investigate more into Ella's background before her husband had cleared up their history in Mirage Mesa, he wouldn't have spent all of his life searching for the man. Despite all of his hard work, he'd only been able to get one suspect as his family's killer, Kevin Rodrigo, but he had no evidence to back up his claim, and now that he was a wanted criminal, his chances of ever getting to know if Kevin was his enemy were so slim. "Was that why you'd been going after the Doc Roll and destroying all of their shady business for years?" Mia asked, trying not to look as curious and sympathetic as she felt. "But yet I never found him," he said with a shrug. "What are you going to do if you were to find him?" she asked, knowing and feeling that everything he'd said, the subject of the man responsible for his parents' death, was the most painful. "If I were ever to find him," he trailed off as a slow, wicked smirk appeared on his face. "I'd do the same thing he did to my family, and if he had his own family, I'd make sure they all suffer the fate I'd suffered because of him." For some reason, even though Mia had no idea who this man was, and even though she felt that he deserved whatever Neil planned to do to him, she couldn't help but feel an unknown fear seep into her bones. Its chills traveled down her stomach, making her suddenly nauseous and anxious. She couldn't pinpoint the strange feeling, but it made her so uncomfortable to know that he'd planned to ruin the man and his family. And she knew from the cold, blank look on his face that he wasn't joking about anything he'd said about ruining the family. However, she had to know for sure. She was understanding more about him with every passing moment. What if he had children? Will you burn them just like he'd done your parents? He fell silent. But then, remembering the hurt he'd had to go through for years, the pain he'd had to suffer from David Wayner because he had no home to return to, Neil couldn't care less if the man responsible for his parents' deaths had children. He couldn't sympathize with his enemy's family when they'd deprived him of his. No matter the time that had passed, it wasn't enough to soften his heart and take away his hatred towards the unknown man. "No," he replied to her question with a voice that sounded so detached and blank without batting an eye. "I won't burn them. I will make them so miserable they'd beg to be burned instead." An unknown chill traveled down her spine at his words and her palms turned sweaty for no reason. She knew his hatred ran deep, and if she were in his shoes she'd want nothing but revenge, but why was she feeling like she was about to lose something if she didn't convince him of not including an offspring of an enemy in a war that was waged by the father? "But his family has nothing to do with your conflict with the father, you. The fact that they are his family has everything to do with it, Mia." He never thought twice before killing all the innocent servants working in the Galvera estate because of his wife's mistake, nor did he when burning my family. Because of him, they never had a proper burial nor a grave to visit. "But, Neil, you still can't take your anger and hate on people who had nothing to do with this. If you can't forgive the father, at least you could find it in your heart to forgive the family." Those words from her somehow put her instantly beyond all limits of his tolerance, and his voice took on a chilling, deadly finality as he said, "Nobody," he said, gets a chance of forgiveness from me, Mia. Ever. But, are you supporting my enemies or me? He demanded coolly. No, I am not. I'm just saying. Then that's the end of this discussion. I don't want to hear any more from you. His voice had a dangerous edge, but Mia refused to back down, because her heart didn't want her to. I think you're much more heartless like the other Galvaros than you know. You're pushing your luck, lady? Mia flinched at the coldness in his voice and the ruthlessness in his eyes. Wordlessly, she got up and gathered their empty glasses and took them into the kitchen, displeased by this new side of him, the streak of ruthless finality that enabled him to hate and never forgive without a backward glance. She could understand if he'd let the hate be between him and the killer, but what has it got to do with the other innocent family members, who she didn't know but yet was trying to support and save from a fate that was about to befall them if Neil Wayner was to go after them? Nonetheless, the other part of him that broke her heart was the way he'd said it and the look on his face. When he'd first taken her against her will to this cabin, all his actions and words had been motivated by necessity and desperation, never in justified harshness, and she'd understood that. But until these last few minutes, when she'd heard the menace in his voice and seen it on his face, she hadn't been able to understand how anyone could possibly think Neil Wayner was cold-blooded enough to commit murder. But if other people had seen him this way, she could well imagine what they'd think. More clearly than ever before, Mia realized that although they were intimate in bed, he still took her like a stranger. He didn't like her enough to forgive and let go, and she also realized that not until he'd let go of his hatred, he'd never be able to love. Mia walked into her room to get her sleeping clothes. She turned on the room's light and changed her clothes in the bathroom. She was so preoccupied with her thoughts that instead of immediately going to his room like she'd promised to spend every night with him until their time here was over, she sat down on her bed, lost in thought. Several minutes later she heard the door of the room open and she jumped and jerked her head around as he walked in and said, "This is a very unwise decision on your part, Mia. I suggest you reconsider it carefully." He was standing casually in the doorway, his shoulder propped against the frame, arms crossed over his chest, his face impassive. But Mia had no idea what decision he was referring to, and although he still looked distant, he did not look or sound like the sinister predator he'd seemed in the dimly lit living room. She almost wondered if much of what had alarmed her about him had been a combined trick of her imagination and the firelight, or if she was overthinking everything. Mia stood up and walked slowly toward him, uncertain, searching his face. "Is that supposed to be your idea of an apology?" She raised a brow. He frowned. "I wasn't aware I have anything to apologize for." The arrogance of that was so typical of him that she almost laughed, but held back and instead crossed her arms against her chest and said, "Try out the word rude and see if that makes you aware." "Was I rude? I didn't mean to be. I warned you that the discussion was going to be extremely unpleasant for me, but you wanted to hear it anyway." He looked as if he honestly felt that he was being unjustly accused of being rude, but she continued anyway. "I see," she said, stopping in front of him. "Then this is actually all my fault? It must be, whatever this is referring to, because I have no idea what you're referring to." "You don't know, is that it? You are completely unaware of the fact that your tone of voice to me and there was." She searched for the right words and settled for something that didn't quite fit, cold and callous and needlessly harsh. He shrugged with an indifference that Mia suspected was partially feigned from the look in his silver eyes. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but his ego was holding him back from doing so. Instead, he said, "You aren't the first person to accuse me of being all those things and a lot more. I'll submit to your judgment. I am cold, callous, and harsh," Mia provided, bending her head, trying not to laugh at how ridiculous the whole debate sounded now. In the past, Neil had gone out of his way to do everything for her without taking the credit. He'd sponsored her education and gotten her a priceless guitar, dresses, and now he'd risked his life to save her, and he had wanted to die when he thought he'd failed. He was anything but cold and callous. Those other people had been wrong. Her laughter faded abruptly, and she felt an aching remorse for what she had said and what they had all said to make him believe he was what he wasn't. Neil, on the other hand, could not decide whether Mia had actually intended to retaliate against him for some imagined fight by sleeping in here alone when they'd agreed to share his room from now on, which was what had originally angered him when she'd left him sitting alone in the living room for 20 minutes. But now that she'd suddenly stopped laughing and was looking down, he had no idea what else he'd said and done to annoy her again. "Harsh, I am," he agreed bluntly to her words, wishing she'd look up so he could get a good look at her face to know if she was angry at him for being harsh and unable to say out an apology. "Neil," she said to his chin, "the next time anyone tells you you're any of those things, tell them to look much closer." She raised her eyes to his and said softly, "If they did, I think they'll see a rare kind of nobility and an extraordinary gentleness." Neil slowly uncrossed his arms, completely taken aback, feeling his heart turn over exactly the way it always did whenever she looked at him that way. Mia continued to speak with a suppressed laugh. "I don't mean to imply that you aren't also frustrating, controlling, and arrogant, you understand. But you like me anyway," he teased, brushing his knuckles over her flushed cheek, and absurdly relieved that she wasn't mad at him for being him. "Despite all that," he added. "Add Vane to my list," she retorted, and he surprised her by pulling her tightly into his arms, wrapping her securely into his warmth. "Mia," he whispered, bending his head to kiss her, "shut up and give me a kiss." "And demanding, too," she stated against his lips. Neil started to laugh. She was the only woman who'd ever made him feel like laughing while wanting to kiss her all the time. "Remind me never again," he said, deciding to kiss her ear instead because it couldn't move out from under his lips, to go near another woman in the future. He traced the curve of her ear with his tongue and she shivered, holding him close as she whispered another breathless summation of his character. "And incredibly sensual, and very, very sexy." On the other hand, he smilingly amended his earlier words, kissing her nape, "There is just no substitute for a woman like you, and no other can replace you."